my name is Scott Brooks. I am a partner and vice president with Org Vitality, and I am delighted here to introduce this webinar that will be delivered by Dr. Victoria Hendrickson called Stop the Insanity, Innovations to Ease the Comment Analysis Burden. So hope you're all ready. This is going to be kind of fun. Now, if you know anything about Org Vitality, one of the things we are is we represent a fusion of program effectiveness in things like employee surveys along with technical expertise. And what we mean by this is that we like to blend the science and the consulting and really dig into what are the right questions we're trying to ask with the right kind of technology that supports all of that. And so I think this webinar you're about to see is a terrific example of exactly that. And this program too that you're about to see is built on a lot of experience that we have. The consultants and technologists from Org Vitality have built and delivered survey programs for more than, at this point, more than 40 out of the Fortune 100, 87 out of the Fortune 500, 11 of the best places to work winners, and numerous nonprofits. We're very proud of our work with the United Nations and Save the Children and places like the Stop TB Partnership and so forth, which really reflects our values. We also had been selected to support both Mayflower and the IT Survey Group Survey Consortia to be thought partners and norm providers for them. And we've done a lot of global work in our surveys, and 360s have been, just in the past year, conducted in over 100 countries with over 30 languages. So not to get too deep into our broad experience, but just this is to let you know that this is some of the foundation upon which some of these other findings that will be presented here today will be based. And let me introduce our presenter. Our presenter is Dr. Victoria Hendrickson. She is a partner and vice president with Org Vitality, has a PhD in organizational psychology. And what she is here to talk about is various highlights from a multi-year program of research into qualitative survey data. What do we know? What can we find out? What questions can we ask? How do we balance up the quantitative and the qualitative into what really drives action and change in organizations? A lot of these findings have been presented at various kinds of conferences, including the maybe most notably the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology conference every year in the springtime, but also numerous other places. And she will be highlighting a lot of what she's found. And actually, a lot of these results and findings and a lot of this backdrop is covered in a book that Victoria has written and was published and just came out earlier this year. And so I invite you for the rest of the session to sit back and enjoy and absorb some of the highlights of what Victoria is going to be talking about here. Now, just some housekeeping notes very quickly. You don't need to take copious notes. These slides will be sent out at the end of the session. Also, if you have questions, save them for the end. We expect to have 10-15 minutes for some Q&A at the end. And beyond that, then, I'm delighted to introduce to you Victoria. Victoria?
Excellent. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate the intro, and thank you everyone for joining. It's great to see a mix of people on the line, some familiar faces and also some new ones. So those of you that do know me know that this is a topic I get pretty excited about. So I'm just going to go ahead and dive in. Do have a lot to cover since we're really pulling together some of the findings from several years of research. The goal is to give you the highlights from all of those in order to think about how you might use comments or other kind of text analysis in your own organizations. And what I want to do is I want to start with both the opportunity for this kind of data and then the challenges we all have in front of us. And then we'll step back and see how we can address these. And, if we start with the opportunity, I think we can all agree that, there's a lot to get from this kind of data. And I think that's why a lot of us are here today. Comments represent a great way to capture the employee voice. As all of our organizations get larger and more complex, it's really easy to get lost in spreadsheets and quantitative data. But the comments are a really unique opportunity to hear the context, to hear the tone, and just the way employees talk about things. And it gives leaders a really great sense of what is the voice of the organization? What do people sound like out there? And, aside from the voice and the tone, we also get novel kinds of feedback from comments. Sometimes we're getting the answers to questions we didn't think to ask. Sometimes we're getting meaningful suggestions on how we might improve low scores. But the point here is, we're not limited to the questions we knew to ask. That said, these are all great opportunities, but I think a lot of the reasons we're here today is because they each present a lot of work. In order to get to the value of each of those opportunities, there's a lot to get through, and there are a number of sort of technological solutions out there, yet challenges in matching the right technological solution to your purpose. So a lot of you on the phone might feel like the guy on the screen on the right here, buried in comments, really looking for the needle in the haystack. And my goal today is to take some of that burden away and give you some tools to address this kind of challenge. So that takes us to part of the challenge itself. And I think a lot of the challenge is that comments can be a bit of a black box. There are so many possible uses of comment data, and we have a lot of expectations. So a lot of people look for sentiment in comments. What's the overall tone or emotionality of how people are describing things? I mentioned earlier suggestions. What are ways to improve on issues or barriers in the organization, topics? What do people bring up that they didn't cover elsewhere on the survey? Sometimes more instantaneous feedback, the general employee voice, and what other questions that we need to ask from the survey. And I mention all of these because they're all important, but they all require a different approach of how we would write the questions, solicit the data, and of course, analyze the data to get the most meaningful feedback. That said, a lot of people go for a more general approach that they're trying to get a little bit of each of these. And that general approach might give you an overall sense of the comments you have, but it's not going to provide the detail to drive action. So my first piece of advice for you today, and if you hang up and hear nothing else, maybe that's okay. But the one thing to hang on to is to start by clearly defining a purpose from the beginning and building your approach around that purpose of what we want out of the comments, rather than by the technology that might be available to you or might be the shiniest new thing out in the market. And one way we like to clarify that purpose and help people define what they most want out of the comments is by stakeholder group. Across your organization, you're going to have different stakeholders that are looking for different uses of the comments, depending on their data sophistication, their user experience needs, and really what kind of action they're looking to drive. So we've got the employees providing feedback, might want to hear back. Line managers getting reports often need some more context. We've got some execs that are looking for that overall voice and explanation of why scores are the way they are. OD and HR might be looking for some hotspots. And then we've got special groups that might have unique interests, and some survey leads putting it all together. Now, our previous webinars have gone through the comment journey from the perspective of those employees providing the feedback and of your survey leads navigating the landscape of solutions to solve some of these comment issues. Quick pause to say if you're interested in those, certainly let us know. Happy to provide slides and recordings. But today we're going to come at this from a bit of a different perspective, and that is the perspective of a busy but interested line executive. Often we find that these people, see the scores, but they really want to know why. They're looking for some context of why scores are the way they are. They're looking for examples of why people are frustrated in certain ways and for ideas of how they can make some quick changes. These executives are really important consumers of your data, but they're often not looking for the same detail or technicalities as a survey lead or even perhaps some of your change management kinds of stakeholder groups. So we're not looking for fancy stats relationships or p-values, but we're looking for the critical comments they can't miss and suggestions of what they want to change. So what we actually did is we did a quick survey about survey comments to ask what are some of the comment priorities of your line executives. And what we found is, for the most part, it really lined up with that idea of getting that actionable feedback and set of examples that gives unique insight that adds to rather than repeating quant findings. So you can see in the word cloud here, the words that are the biggest, came up most frequently. They're looking for feedback, commentary, and suggestions of how they can improve. And then if we look at some of the challenges that survey practitioners like all of you on the phone face in getting that data to their executives, it's really extracting the insight. So often the data is there, but it takes time and a well-matched approach to really draw out that actionable feedback. So, when we step back and say, what would it take to get those busy executives the actionable kinds of data they're looking for? It really comes down to, three main points to guide our approach. The first is asking the right question. We want to make sure we're asking about topics that are top of mind for leaders. We want to analyze the data with the end in mind to find the most actionable and detailed suggestions. And then, once we have that data, we want to make sure we feed it back in a way that really drives meaningful action, that makes it easy for a leader to identify and move forward on some of this comment data. So at OV, we've got a particular approach on how we want to go after identifying that actionable data. And that approach is something we call comment usefulness. And when I say useful, we're going back to the overall goal of a survey as a means to start a conversation or to start meaningful improvement efforts. So, I'm going to say the word useful a lot today. And when I talk about useful comments, I'm meaning one that's likely to drive change. And in our research, we've found that the comments that are useful and likely to drive change are the ones that are most specific and relevant to the question we asked. So in our survey practice, what we do is we shape our comment approach around increasing the amount of useful comments we get, identifying those within the data set, and then highlighting them in a way that's going to help those leaders prioritize the most critical data. So we'll get to the details of how we shape and identify those useful comments. But to get there, I want to step back to our general model for survey projects, and then we'll look at how we apply that to our comment approach and the kinds of ways we would report on these kinds of data. So I want to start with this model we've got here on the left side. It's a three-part model of strategy, insight, and action. We use this to guide all of our survey or organizational effectiveness projects. And in this case, what we want to start with is the strategy of the science, how we want to design usefulness into the survey to make sure we're getting comments on the topics that matter most. We're going to look at insight on how we analyze the data and report it effectively. And then, of course, the action speaks for itself, how we want to take those findings and use them to drive real change. So, if we take this and we start with the strategy piece, we want to think about how do we want to design the survey itself so that we're starting with more useful comments rather than really placing the burden on the analysis phase. So when we're designing for usefulness, we want to start by asking ourselves a couple of questions. The first is more topical in what we want to know, and the second is how we make sure we get good data on that. So I want to start with the first point, which is really about asking the right questions. And we're going to talk about this in terms of open ends, but I think, philosophically, this will ring true for a lot of parts of your survey and making sure we're asking the questions that matter most for your company. Here I want to give an underlying sort of philosophical point at OV about the focus of your survey. And that's that your survey should be uniquely you. So if you hold up your survey, it should feel like your company in terms of culture and how you're phrasing items, as well as the topics you're asking and how they're related to your strategy and what gives you a unique advantage. So in other words, you should be able to find something relevant to your industry, your culture, and your strategy in your survey compared to any others. And while that applies to the whole survey, when we think about the comment section, we want to use this in the same way. We want to maximize the type of data we get rather than asking a vague question. So oftentimes we hear people say, shouldn't I just ask a broad question? Shouldn't I just ask, is there anything else you want to tell us? And certainly you might get some useful data back from that, but if we can focus the question and ask something that's uniquely relevant to your company, we're more likely to get the kinds of data that are going to help your leaders make decisions and move forward. And what we found in our research is that employees can really tell you a lot, whether it's about barriers to getting the work done, marketplace concerns they're hearing from customers, or other kinds of strategic issues. So instead of scrutinizing the comments or studying employees and things like their emotions and going backwards to what we think that means about operational work concerns, we want to ask them directly. So we want to ask them, what are their opinions on the topics that really matter? We want to know what they're seeing out there that can ultimately help your leaders make important decisions. And so, with that philosophy in mind, the first step to designing a good open-ended item, or, really any item on a survey, is just to have a conversation with your business leaders. We don't want to start by asking them, what are the open-ended survey questions you want to see? Because, that can start in a certain place, but we want to ask more broadly, what's important? What's keeping you up at night? What drives performance? Where do you feel you're most at risk? And start to get a sense of these broad topics and where employee feedback could really give them some unique insight, and where these open-ended questions could help them start to piece together some of the other questions on your survey. And this kind of conversation helps us design a more focused item. So earlier I mentioned, focused items compared to more broad, very open prompts. And we really want to stay towards those focused items in order to get leaders data on the topics they're most curious about. So if they're curious about things like customer experience, safety, or quality, we want to ask about that directly. And rather than asking employees generally how they feel about the topic, we want to ask them for that specific feedback. So we'll ask about barriers, suggestions for improvements, where problems might crop up, even times when it goes well. And when we start with this leadership-driven, focused kind of topic, and then we ask a direct question, we find that that open-ended item is better set up to collect good feedback and better set up to essentially answer the questions that leaders are asking. All that said, this is a great start for how we want to ask the question itself, but you can write the perfect item, and as many of you on the phone has found, that doesn't mean that all of your comments are going to be useful. And again, when we talk about those useful comments, those are specifically the ones that are likely to drive organizational change. So you can write a very specific open-ended item and still get a lot of people that write something like, pay me more. We found in our research that the comments that are most useful without any kind of intervention, we tend to get about 5% of the total comments fit that most useful designation. So another way to look at it is, without any special intervention, even if you have a pretty good item, 95% of the comments you get back have that employee voice, but probably don't have enough description of an issue or a relevant solution that's likely to drive any kind of change forward. So, one approach is certainly to weed through the 95% and see if you can find that needle in the haystack. But, we've gone another route. Rather than placing all of the burden on the analysis, we've developed some interventions to help increase that base rate of the usefulness of comments. Certainly, we'll have some analysis tips coming, but we find the better way to start is to move around this 95 and 5% ratio. And so, that takes us to some of the framing of how we ask about comments. We talked about the question itself and making it as specific as possible, but we also want to look at how we're framing the conversation and how it appears to an employee on the survey. So often the directions or the system text that precede the comment question is an afterthought, but we found it really impacts how employees approach the comment box. So traditionally, directions or system text are really about clarifying the purpose, saying, this section is to provide additional feedback, anything you say is anonymous, et cetera, et cetera. In the last couple of years, we've seen some researchers move to what's called motivation text. And that gives a little more insight, and it explains the importance of the comments. So often in motivation text, we'll see phrases like, take your time, your comments are really important, leaders are going to read through all of these, etc. So it's intended to slow employees down a little bit and make sure that they know they'll feel heard. And then we've been using a more optimized approach of actively nudging employees to provide useful feedback. So when we say nudge, we're talking about a way to give employees some guidance in the system text. We want to tell them what kinds of feedback we're looking for, maybe give them some examples to help them frame up how they can provide us the most helpful feedback. And when I say nudge, we're using the behavioral concept of nudging to get better comments here. So the concept of nudging was made very popular by Thaler and Sunstein in this book, Nudge. Great book, highly recommend it for general OD interventions. We found a number of ways to use nudges on our surveys. One certainly is this comment approach, but there are certainly others. And the goal of a nudge is to set up a choice that helps people make a good choice, but without removing options, changing incentives, or making it harder for them. So some examples here. One we've got here is in the health and wellness space. So the example we've got here is how food is placed in school cafeterias, where everyone wants their kids to eat healthy. The nudge is placing some fruit at an eye level and candy at the bottom. So kids can certainly choose the candy. There's no incentive not to, but the fruit is easier. It's at eye level, and we know that people tend to choose what's at eye level. So basically, we're using framing, examples, and defaults to help people make good choices without incentivizing. So what does that look like in a survey? Basically, we're using these kinds of nudges in the instructions. Instead of just saying, this is anonymous or confidential, please provide your feedback, we're framing it up by helping employees understand what kind of feedback is most useful. And in certain ways that helps them format their feedback, and it also shows them that it's really important to us. We're looking for specific things in their feedback. And we've done some research on these nudges. We actually were able to do an experimental field study to see the effectiveness of the nudge. And as you can see by the graphs on here, we found it to be really effective. When we compared the nudged group to a control group, we found we got about 5 times more useful feedback in that control group. And so our next slides here are going to look at the difference and how that nudge impacts the comments themselves. So, here on the left, we've got a comment in blue, and this was not nudged. This is just from the control group. So we asked, what's going to make this company a better place to work? And the employee said, implementation of best practices. And that may be true. They may need a lot of best practices, but we don't really know, why they need best practices, what kind, or what kind of problem it's going to solve. On the right here, we've got a nudged comment. So here the employee says, improve our shifts. I'm fine with rotating shifts. It would be better if we could have at least the same shift for 2 weeks in a row instead of every week to be different, because having different shift every single week can be very tiring. So here we get a lot more clarity on the issue and the possible solution. We see the same kind of difference in specificity in the second row of comments. Again, we're just getting a much better idea of what the employee is frustrated with and how they think the problem could be solved. So you might be noticing some differences across these comments. So let's look at how these are different between the nudge and control groups. On both set of comments, we measured both positivity and negativity. We find it's more effective to measure those tones separately than an overall tone of the comment. It gives us a little more nuance. But overall, we see that neither of those were really impacted by the nudge. Positivity is low, but it's really low in both groups, and the negativity is high, as you've all probably noticed reading comments. But again, it's very comparable across the two groups. That said, one thing you might have noticed in the comments on the last slide is there is a difference in length. So the nudge does make the comments a good bit longer, and that makes sense. People who are nudged are being reminded that they need to provide a problem or issue and a relevant solution. So, it takes more words to describe a problem and solution than to simply write out what's top of mind. But I think it's important to notice the distinction here. The comments are certainly longer, but the tone isn't changing, simply the depth of the description. So we're not getting people to complain more. We're just getting them to give us more context and essentially go beyond the description and give us that recommended solution. So, that does give us more of what we need in terms of data to move forward and more context, although it does bring some risk. There is a risk of ending up like this person on the slide here. You can get lost in piles of really long comments and essentially increase the burden. However, we want to balance that with the opportunity to dig deep, find the needles in the haystack, and identify those really well thought out and clearly described ideas. This is really the challenging piece, and at OV we've been researching this a while and identifying some ways to identify those needle in the haystack at scale. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that solution and how we approach this. There are certainly other ways you can identify these comments, but the best way we've found to optimize the usefulness construct is with what we call the voice, and it is the value optimized intelligent comment extractor. So, what is that? That is a research-driven algorithm that's going to identify the comments most likely to drive change. So it's based on all of the research pieces I've been stepping through so far, but rather than coding each of these comments individually, the algorithm is going to process each comment in any language and assign a 0 to 100 score or usefulness quotient. And that score can be used either in research to figure out who's writing useful comments, where are they coming from, or in reporting to bubble up the most useful ideas and put those useful, actionable, and specific ideas in front of the right people who can move forward from them. So, this UQ score is really easy to use in that it just shows up as a 0 to 100 score, but it's based on, as I said, quite a bit of research. It's based on characteristics of the comment and parameters around how the employee works and how they experience the work environment. So for the comment itself, length matters. We looked at some of those graphs that the longer nudged comments do tend to be more useful. There's just a specific threshold of how many characters it takes to provide a useful comment, since we need a lot of specificity there. The characteristics of an employee who write a useful comment generally relate to opinions, and their opinions more about the work, less about broad engagement. So we find that useful comments tend to be written by employees that see an opportunity to improve the way things are done, and they believe change is possible. So it's not an over-the-top favorable kind of employee who just thinks everything is perfect, but it's also not an employee that's completely skeptical of the process. You've got to believe the process will work, but also see, what's right for improvement, what could be changed. And beyond those opinions, usually it's someone with a little more exposure that's likely to write a useful comment. So a useful comment can come from anywhere in the organization, regardless of level or tenure or function, but some exposure to the external market or to greater levels of information about how things get done does give employees more context of being able to provide a relevant solution that we need to see in those comments. So that's a little bit about how we calculate the UQ and the kinds of things that come into it. Want to show you a little bit about what that looks like and what a leader might get to move forward from something like this. We tend to load all of the comments into a master user report or also a dynamic portal with the rest of results. Looks a little bit like the screenshot on the right side of the screen. If you zoom in, or when you get these slides, you will notice these are mocked up comments. So it's really just to give you a sense of the kinds of visualizations and experience available without giving you any data here. And I want to say these aren't for lower level frontline managers with 20 or 30, 40 comments. Those kinds of managers, we really encourage to just read the comments. Go through them all, read them, get a sense of what people are saying. This is really for a high-level leader, like our curious but busy executive who needs to look across the comments and prioritize what they're going to start with and what they're going to move forward with. So we want to organize by usefulness scores of the comment. That's that color-coded heat map kind of column in the middle, as well as organized by opinions and demographics of employees who wrote the comment. And that allows us to do a couple things. You can organize and distribute the comments to specific topic owners. So if we want to filter by topic, let's grab those career development comments and send them to the head of talent management. We can also separate comments by relevant opinions. So if there's an open end about improving the workplace, you can split those out by opinions on willingness to recommend or intent to stay, to see how those comments from people who are really positive differ from those who aren't. And similarly, you can do that same thing by demographics to find how different parts of the organization are writing in their comments. So, do managers write different kinds of career development comments than individual contributors? Do they have a different level of specificity or different kind of suggestion? And then, of course, importantly, you can sort and filter by UQ to get the most relevant, most actionable comments from any of those groups to start with. So the idea is that once you have all of these comments organized by usefulness and by segments, it's easy to use them to drive action. All of this assumes that by finding the most useful comments, we're making a material difference in action. And so, I want to step aside from exactly what this looks like for leaders to look at some of our more recent research that we use to check this assumption that these useful comments that we're highlighting here really are moving things forward. So, the next question we've got here is, given how central usefulness is to this overall approach, does it work? Does it matter? Are these useful comments actually leading to change? Specifically, how does action on the survey change when managers receive comments? And how does it change when they receive really useful comments? So from here, I'm going to give you a couple numbers. I'm going to focus first on the left here. What we've got is a multi-year study where we looked at UQ in managerial groups in time 1, and then scores on if employees felt that there was positive action on the survey in time 2. And what we see here is that managerial groups that had higher UQ scores on the first year had some really strong positive relationships, that in the second year, those groups felt that there was really significant action on the survey. So these are good relationships, especially for a field study, but we wanted to go a step further and see, are they just more positive, or are they changing differently? Were they positive to start, or do they use this useful feedback to change in a different way compared to other groups? So on the right, what we've got is UQ in aggregate in these bars to see how those opinions on survey change have moved from previous years. So what we've got here is the groups with the highest UQ in the first year are not just more positive about taking action, but they're improving at a much different rate. You can see that those blue bars on the highest UQ on the far left are much more positive than the green bars with the smaller UQ groups. So getting that more useful feedback is helping people change at a faster rate. So it's a great relationship. We were excited and frankly a little relieved to see it, that this UQ really is helping people change at a faster rate. But we wanted to see, is this related to the usefulness of the comments? Are they really getting better data? Or is this just the act of receiving comments itself and getting a little extra data? So first, what we've got here on the left, dimensions from that employee survey, and these scores are change. So, whether they're improving or declining. And we've got groups that received and didn't receive comments. And overall, there are a couple changes here. Those green bars are the groups that did receive comments. They are more positive in places like senior leadership, but largely these groups are similar. now I've got that same graph, but with UQ band. So, pay attention here to those blue bars on the graph. These are the groups that had the highest UQ in the first survey. And then, of course, the bars here are the change between the two surveys. So, first thing you might notice is that the blue bars are much different than all of the others. They're qualitatively standing out of how they've changed from the first to the second survey. So they've improved the most on every dimension except for that manager dimension. It's acting a little differently here, but far and away they are changing in a different way than all of the groups with lower UQ. So especially things like senior leadership, survey action, and customer focus, they're improving much more rapidly. So overall, we're finding that getting leaders these more useful comments is relating to major improvements, and it's a cross topic. It's not just about the survey itself. So this tells us that we definitely want to capitalize on the usefulness as we analyze and process our comments and make it a priority to get these kinds of comments to our leaders. And as we get into how we want to act on survey comments, there are certainly going to be reflections of other parts of the survey process. We want to focus some action planning on bringing a couple of things together. And the first is clear assignments. So who has a role in reviewing and acting on the comments, and exactly what are they supposed to do? We want those to be really clear so that once people have the comments, they're able to dive right in. Then, of course, there's what they're looking at. So are they getting something that's user-friendly and makes that assignment easy to move forward on? And then how we support the process. Often leaders really want to go through all of the comments, but they can end up in a bit of an analysis paralysis, just reading every single comment and not knowing how to wade through them and how to cut through some of the negativity to find those actionable pieces of feedback to move forward with. So earlier we looked at different stakeholder groups that use comments and the different purposes each of them might have. And here they are again. So each of these groups are going to receive comments generally, and they often have a specific assignment involved in what they're looking for and what we expect them to do with these. And in our experience, we find that each of these groups tend to get more out of the comments with some really specific instructions. That's going to help avoid that analysis paralysis and identify some pieces of low-hanging fruit that they can address and say we're making this action on the survey, often as a part of larger action planning efforts. So those specific instructions are generally to learn more about areas that scored poorly on the survey quantitatively and to identify a couple of stroke of the pen changes to make. And this is, again, going to serve a couple of purposes. You can find a couple of tangible things to do and improve right away, and you can tell employees that you made these specific changes based on their feedback to show them they're being heard. Often we find that, when companies are working on some really big action planning goals, sometimes around leadership or change management, going into the comments and finding some low-hanging fruit, something easy you can change, almost buys you some time in action planning. You can get back with employees and say, we found this in the comments and we're making this change right away. And that gives you some time to work on the bigger things that are going to take a little longer and different kinds of communication patterns to cascade. So that's one way to prioritize and give a very specific assignment to a leader of find one, maybe two things you can just do with a stroke of a pen from these comments. And that said, to help leaders find those critical comments, we want to use some specific strategies and reporting formats to make that easy for them to do. So we use this interactive tool on the screen here with abilities to segment and compare comments by relevant demographics, opinions, and UQ. We looked at this a little bit earlier. And again, the goal here is to make it easy for them to organize based on their purpose of what they're looking for, the part of the organization they're responsible for, and the usefulness of the feedback that's going to make it easy for them to move forward. We might not give access to all of this data for every one of those stakeholder groups we talked about, but the point is to give them the comments they need and then the interactive abilities to be able to dig into what's most important for their purpose. So if they need to be working across things by level or by segment. We want to make sure that they have the ability to drill down and get the comments, that are going to be most helpful and drive that rather than get lost in a bigger pile of comments. So, this makes it easier for users to find the specific comments they should be working on, but we do find that some still get lost in the purpose and what they're supposed to be moving forward with here. And that's really where a lot of you on the phone come in today with really supporting the use of comments. We want to make sure that we're setting up leaders for success with a clear assignment, as well as some ongoing support as they start to dive into this data, especially because they're likely diving into this data alongside a lot of other survey data. So when we give the comments out, we often suggest giving instructions, not just to read and try to guess what's behind each one and look for ideas for improvement, but to learn about the descriptions, learn more about these issues. Let's not take this as an evaluation of you, leader, but let's look at this as a way to understand why scores are the way they are and understand the descriptions of these issues from all of the employees that you might not have a chance to talk to on a day-to-day basis. And part of this context is just some information about comments as well. A lot of you on the phone likely read comments very often and probably find that comments tend to be more negative than positive. And that's true even on topics that have relatively high survey results. So we find this over and over in our research. It's just the way comments work. And, especially if we're asking people for suggestions or descriptions of issues, we're likely to get more negative kinds of responses. So instead of just handing them over and saying, find a couple things to work on, we want to tell people what to expect. So we want to frame up, these are going to be negative. We expect comments to be negative, but these do tend to be the most useful comments. So if we can give them that frame of, hey, if they are negative and they are long, they're likely to have the kind of detail that have a relevant solution that might actually address the problem. That gives leaders a different frame of how to start looking at those comments rather than being surprised and perhaps overwhelmed by very negative comments. And of course, taking that surprise factor away and giving clear directions helps give them a much easier time to actually go in with an objective mindset and find something to work on. So, as we start to close out here, I want to step back and take a broader look at our approach to usefulness. So we're going back to that strategy, insight, action model here, where we're making sure we have the purpose, the mechanics, and the action orientation wrapped into our overarching framework of how we look at these comments. Certainly, we have our approach to how we do this very specifically, but I think within this framework, anyone here can take back some of these strategies and use them in their own survey. So, to recap, in the strategy portion, we're really looking at design. So are we designing the item in a way that encourages actionable data? That includes writing a strategic, specific item and then using some kind of nudge intervention to increase the amount of useful comments. When we get to the insight or analysis phase, this is where we find it's really helpful to organize comments by usefulness or some other measure of action orientation or quality. This is also where we look at different kinds of segmentations that are going to be relevant to the topic of your item to help you get at those different pockets that have different experiences. And then most importantly, action. When it comes to action, we want to distribute the comments to the people who can move things forward. So whether that's top-level leaders or centralized specialty groups, we want to get comments in the right hands and give them a clear frame on how to interpret and use them and let employees know that their feedback was heard and is moving forward. So the UQ tool is our approach to getting leaders more useful data and highlighting it in an actionable way. I'd be more than happy to show it to anyone here. We've got all kinds of reports and dynamic portals that can help your leaders get to the most actionable feedback. But I also want to emphasize the point that this framework is research-based and applicable in different kinds of ways. So, even taking one piece from this framework can help you get more detailed and actionable feedback to drive things forward and keep you from getting lost in the haystack. So, with that, I'm going to pause for a second, turn it back to Scott, see if we've got any questions.
Well, thank you, Victoria. I think this is helpful. And every time I listen to you speak, even though I've clearly heard you talk through this a number of times, I always pick up something new. And I hope that those of you in the audience are also picking up a couple of good nuggets. We're turning to questions now, and some have started to come in. If any of you have questions, please pop them into the question box by the in the GoToWebinar app, and we can get to them. But in the meantime, let me start asking you some, Victoria, about what's already come in. And I'm going to distill a couple here, maybe into one. You've covered this to some extent, but can you sort of wrap up in a package the difference between usefulness in terms of useful comments and also sentiment, which is something that I think that a lot of people tend to code for and look at. How would you distinguish those, and how would you play them out in terms of the framework you were talking about?
Yeah, that's a great point. So I'll start with sentiment, because I think that does tend to be a default approach for text analysis and survey comments. When we think about sentiment, this is going to be the topic or content of a comment, and it tends to work well for very broad open-ended questions. So that kind of question where we ask, is there anything else you want to tell us? And the comments are so wide-ranging that we need some way to pull them all together. Sentiment can be one way to see, generally, how are people talking about a certain topic, whether it's the topic itself or even, levels of emotionality within that. I think that can be useful for description purposes. Now, when we talk about usefulness, we're not talking about the way something is described. We are talking about the likelihood that that comment can drive organizational change. So it's like, how badly does this comment need to get in front of one of your leaders? It's more about the level of detail and specificity in that comment. We can't always know if it's a good suggestion in a useful comment, but it has the pieces and the structure to be able to provide the feedback needed to move organizational change forward.
So sentiment is basically the tone of something, but usefulness is, can you do something with it?
Exactly. Yep.
I think that's almost wrapping up the way you described that, your whole talk, in a way, about let's figure out how to drive towards action.
Absolutely.
Okay.
You can describe all kinds of sentiment, but we don't know if it actually has what we need to change.
Yeah. And related, when you were talking about the sort of spreadsheet view where you could rank comments by usefulness, you also had some sentiment-ish opinions related there. Can you connect those two to coding for sentiment versus sorting by the opinions?
Yeah, it's a great question. So on those views, when we're looking at UQ of comments, we do like to pair it with a relevant quantitative item. So, if we're asking an engagement related open end, often we will pair it with, does someone intend to stay or leave? If we're asking about safety, we might pair it with a safety quantitative item. And the goal with that is to see, how the descriptions and suggestions from people who are positive and negative are, both similar or different. So, if we take the engagement example, and, let's say everyone is just complaining about their career development opportunities. If we see that from people who are intending to stay and leave, that means something different than if it's just the people who are intending to leave. So it's a different interpretation there. And so in a way, it can align with some sentiment kinds of codings in terms of positivity and negativity. It's a little different since it is more specific to that topic that we asked about on the survey. I will say it is different in that it is, based on favorability rather than a range of sort of emotional reactions, which is sometimes what different kinds of NLP will pick up with sentiment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Good. Several people are also asking if you could provide a little bit more examples around what does a nudge really look like, a nudge for more useful comments.
Yep. So the nudge is a set of instructions before the open-ended comment box. So, traditionally on surveys, we're just saying this is going to be confidential, give us your honest feedback, etc. With the nudged version, we're giving more insight into what we're looking for in that feedback. So if we're looking for a description of a problem or solution and a relevant suggestion, then we want to frame that up for people and explain to them what kinds of feedback is going to be helpful for us in solving that problem. The exact wording is going to shift a little bit depending on the question, depending on the type of organization, but the overall goal is to give people that sort of frame on what is useful feedback and how can they kind of fit that. Again, certainly people can still write pay me more, but a lot more people tend to fit within that framework of what's going to be useful when they know that's what we're looking for.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any best practices or suggestions to share on how to help managers or leaders or organizations maybe more buy into this usefulness approach versus a traditional theme analysis approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some of it is going to go back to the design of the open-ended question itself. So if we've got a leader that is really concerned about customer experience, and we work with that leader to craft a question about improving the customer experience or targeting certain kinds of customers that need a little extra support, when we get the comments back, I think if you were to ask any leader, do you want to see the general themes of these comments, or do you want to see the most specific and actionable suggestions on how to improve customer experience? We find that almost all go for the latter. They want to see the specifics. Another way to do that is pairing it with a quantitative item. So if you say, we had a lot of people who intend they want to leave the organization, do you want to see the most specific comments from them? Most leaders do. They're looking for some kind of description and actionable kind of feedback to work from. Generally, the themes of how people are feeling are found in other places in the survey. If people are frustrated by tools, if they are frustrated with their managers, that's going to come out somewhere else on your survey anyway.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And here's another question. I think I know the answer to this one too, but at different parts of your presentation, you were talking about useful comments. In the earlier research slides, when you were talking about research, how was those, those were human-coded, research-based kinds of usefulness scores. But later on, when you're talking about using the UQ, you're talking about an algorithm.
Yep, that's right.
Do you have any clarification on that? Or
so early in the research program, our goals were to identify the markers of a useful comment and get to know more about, how can we profile these comments that are useful and actionable in a valid way. And so in order to do that kind of research, we were coding the comments by hand. We had some wonderful interns and research helpers help us with that. And so that helped us be, very precise about how we were coding the comments and identifying usefulness. And then once we got, really clear on that and identified all of those markers of the useful comments, the next challenge was really, how do we do this at scale? We understand usefulness from a research perspective, but that doesn't help our clients that have 200,000 comments and need to figure it out quickly. So then what we did is we took those research findings and built that machine learning algorithm to say, okay, based on these markers, here are, the comments that most fit that, and that assigns that UQ score. So it's essentially a way to get towards that coding of usefulness at a much larger scale.
Nice. Here's one. We know that life cycle surveys are in the air a little bit more these days than they had been. One question is, do you have any suggestions for an open-ended comment to use on an exit survey to collect overall sentiments? Although maybe you could change that word if you want in your answer, as opposed to the typical, is there anything else you would like us to know kind of question?
Mm-hmm.
So,
that's a great
an
question.
exit survey kind of question.
Yeah, and I would agree with, the general premise of moving from is there anything else to something more specific.
I might have a suggestion on that one.
Okay.
If I can step in.
Sure.
If you think about an exit survey, a lot of times people think the question in an exit survey should be, why are you quitting? But in Victoria, in your spirit of asking better questions, a lot of times the real question you're trying to answer is not at the moment of quitting, why are you quitting? But 6 months prior, what is it that can be done to prevent you from quitting, right? And so there's different kinds of ways you can spin that into a research paradigm. But I think one of the things that moves in an exit survey is not necessarily exactly why are you quitting, but where are you going and why, or questions about the decision itself, and things like that people can't know until they're actually deciding to quit. So I think an exit survey, if you unclench from the need to say, why are you quitting? Because you can have a lot of ways to triangulate on that, including looking at prior engagement surveys and did you change your do you look different than your cohort 6 months prior to quitting? But I think you can start in an exit survey to ask a little bit more about the process of quitting itself. Hopefully, people don't have the end sizes of people who are quitting that they do in the end sizes of an annual engagement survey. So you might have a little bit more opportunity to scan those questions differently. I don't know, Victoria, if you had anything else you'd want to add to that kind of an answer.
I think that's good. I think going back to the point of, how do these people that are quitting, how did they look different 6 months ago? Once you're able to do that kind of connection and that kind of research, those answers might feed a really good open end. So if they're having particular frustrations, that might be a good open end to then add to your exit survey later, once you know how their experience is different.
Okay. There's one question that maybe we can use this as the last question, and then give you an opportunity to say any concluding comments you have. But I'm going to combine a couple thoughts here. The employee experience is a term that's being used a little bit more these days to describe what people are chasing in survey work. Usefulness seems to be less topics and maybe how I feel in a sentiment kind of way. Employee experience seems to be maybe broader than that. And usefulness, well, help me untangle these two words. If usefulness is about, getting things done or making change, how does that fit with the ways people might think and talk about employee experience? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you see a connection?
Trying to unpack the question a little bit, but I think if the broad premise is sort of relevance, I would agree. I think usefulness is more of an applied construct. So we're looking for what's going to be most helpful to move things forward, and that can be in how the work gets done, what it means to be a better place to work, how we work together, et cetera. And that's more broad across employee experience than narrowly defined as, what engages an employee. So another way to think about it is if you're, building more of your survey around employee experience, identifying a couple of those key pillars and then asking open-ended questions about, what are either, barriers to that employee experience or what would make it more effective. And usefulness could be a great way to pull the most specific ones to the top.
Good. Well, terrific. As we wind up, any concluding thoughts you'd like to share with the group?
Want to share a couple more webinars we've got coming up. We've got some AI and innovation related webinars on the docket, also some GDPR and cognitive liberty. We know that's something that a lot of people are grappling with. And then other than that, I just want to thank everyone for coming, and I'll be following up with you all individually with the slides and recording, and I'd be happy to have follow-ups with anyone who's looking at how they might apply this.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Victoria. And thank you, everybody, for attending, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks.